Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, welcome. How are you? We are in February of 2024. How's it going? Is it feeling like it's an easier, smoother year? Is it feeling hard and bumpy, or is it feeling the same? Whatever it is, it's okay. This episode with Jen is really interesting. We really had no idea what we were going to talk about. And just when we were kind of checking in with each other, we were talking about the dizziness is coming back a little bit. If we talk a little bit more about what that is, so if you hang in there, you'll understand what it is. I'm fine. It's manageable. But we start out talking about, what is the difference between showing up and talking about what's going on, and when is it complaining or being in it, and how this relates also to somebody's capacity. What if I'm just sharing where I'm at and somebody feels overwhelmed because they feel a need to fix it or they feel burdened? And throughout the episode, I like being concrete, and I really wanted to delineate of when is it that you're in it and you're not just sharing. And at the very, very end, we kind of talk about and we give some concrete examples of what is the difference of when you're speaking for a part as opposed to acting from a part. And it takes us a while to get there. I think the conversation is very rich. We talk about trauma and how trauma shows up. I talk about some new wounds that I'm having and seeing how they're showing up with Jen, talking about when people try and get us to behave a certain way in a relationship. How do we deal with conflict? How do we deal with hard conversations? I think it's a very relatable episode. And when Jen and I stopped recording, we were talking about how our styles and how we conceptualize things are just very different. And I think that works really well for you, the listener. You may be drawn more towards one of our styles or another one of our styles, which is fine. But I think it's just a beautiful blending that the two of us have to bring. And we thought, what are we going to talk about today? And the episode's much longer than it usually is. So I hope you enjoy it. And now on to the show. Hey, Jen, how are you?
Hi, my dear. Oof, I'm okay. I'm waking up. It's January 2nd, so the 6 a.m. wake up to get everybody off to school, and the day started after a nice restful winter break. Was a little rough, but here I am. How are you?
I'm okay. If you are listening for the first time, I was diagnosed with vestibular neuritis a couple of weeks ago and had some crazy out of control dizziness, and it resolved after a week or so, but some of the dizziness is coming back, which is to be expected. So I'm just kind of learning to lean with it. I've learned, like, if I'm in the shower and my head's back and I'm rinsing my hair off, like, just put your elbow against the wall, that if I have something to just ground me in the moment, it seems to make the dizziness more manageable. It's funny. I was talking with a friend this morning who's a little older than I am, and she was telling me about how she and her husband have different things that go on with them, and they just kind of accept it as part of everyday life, which I get. I'm totally fine with that. But I wondered, and I should probably ask her, if the subtext was, and I don't think it was, but this is where I struggle, if the subtext was, we don't talk about those things. And I think that there's a real big thing around aging and what's called being negative. People are asking, how are you doing? And I'm like, the dizziness is back and I'm kind of struggling. And for me, I'm all about being, if you, when you say, how are you? If you want fine, then either tell me that you only want to hear fine, or because you're going to get the truth. That's just how I am.
Yeah.
And it did bring up this question of, and it just didn't occur to me in the moment to ask her, but was there subtext around that? Because I feel like I miss subtext. And the reality is I'm going to continue to talk about what I want to talk about. And I was just talking with someone else that I'm very close to that's had some ongoing health issues, but doesn't talk about it. And I said, you kind of normalize and validate it for those of us that are younger than you, that we hear about those things. And I don't know how I would differentiate, and maybe you have some thoughts, Jen, about how do you differentiate between what is complaining and negativity and what is just sharing honestly about the reality of what's going on. And I want to know, like, if you're struggling, Jen, I want to hear it. I don't want to hear that everything's okay. I want the real picture. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about this.
It's such a great question. I love this question. And as an aside, we can probably do a whole episode on dizziness. I feel like I've got so many stripes of dizziness going on that I live with, and they're different kinds. And I'm really curious how much it affects the population in general. But anyway, so what I'm hearing you ask or want to talk about for a minute is, how do we differentiate what is sort of like that quicksand sucking of negativity? We're just kind of complaining about something and it's not, everything depends, right? So I think even as we say that, I think there's a place for that momentarily, but are you going to unpack and live there? Versus what's just information and sharing information about life, about aging, about health, about how you're doing. I love that about you, that you will answer that question sincerely. And if you're not the kind of person that really wants to go there, or you were raised in such a way that you don't share those things, this is not a message that that's not okay. It's just interesting, right? Just to notice and be curious about. I do find that the things in our society that are sort of more taboo to talk about keep us from sharing information, keep us from our power, keep us from normalizing that it's. So it's funny that one of the differentiating factors that I was going to talk about was what's the energy that you're holding it with, right? Because if it's got a lot of this, there's always, look, I can throw as wonderful a pity party for myself as the next person. And I think that there is a place for that in our healing, in what we experience as human beings. My favorite saying is, I'm human and therefore nothing human is foreign to me. So there's a place for it. But when you're in a dynamic interaction with another person, if it's what's the function of the behavior, right? So if the function is to inform, is to share, is to maybe get ideas, is just to express, I think that you can tell when that's the case, versus if the function of it is really to have that pity party. Sometimes that's a lot for another person to hold space for. And it's why you and I have always talked about, can we get consent? So can I, do you really want to know the real answer? Because I can tell you fine right now, or I can let you know what's really been going on with me. How much time you got, right? But also just the energy with which we hold it. Again, in our perfectionistic society, it's baked into us, I think, that if you're struggling, if something's wrong, there must be something wrong with you. Oh, you poor thing. Or you're a victim and someone should do something. Or if you're walking around like this never happens to anybody else. And that's, do you see this? Did you see the feedback loop there? The more we don't talk, don't normalize, the more then we get that impression that when we are going through something, that it's not a normal human occurrence. And so maybe I'm going to cash in on some emotional capital, feel bad for me, or this or that. I think sometimes that can feel burdensome to other people and be a little bit repelling, right? Because then what's the other person going to do with that? If they have the time and the space and the emotional availability for you, they'll give it, but a lot of us don't have that all the time. So I don't know. I think it really depends. And it's kind of as a therapist, so I'm trained, when I self-disclose, why am I self-disclosing this? What do I want out of this? Is this for my benefit or is this for my client's benefit? And so I wonder if that's something that we can sort of borrow from a little bit. Why am I talking to my neighbor? It's so funny. Right before we connected today, I was talking with, I love old ladies, right? I have this adorable lady on my block, and she's becoming a sister to me. She's a Buddhist. We love talking Dharma. We love talking, and she comes, and she's such a delight. And she had me for an hour. And I came away from that feeling and we were definitely talking about aging. We were talking about aging, and we were talking about dying, and we were talking about some real stuff, but we were talking about it in a container that was, hey, we're all going to do it. I don't know, talking with her, it's not it's this big thing to be avoided at all costs. It's this, I wonder how I'm going to be in those moments. And, talking about times that we've been with people that have been at those different stages, and how do we hold space in a way that's uplifting? Mm-hmm. And that's not to say at this simultaneously, we can't be like, this is scary, or this is intense, or that was painful. It allows for that, but it's not this, I think it kind of boils down to some acceptance. It's not like, oh God, this should never, ever, ever happen. And yet it happens every day to millions of people. Sorry, probably more of an answer than you were looking for.
No, a couple things go on for me. One, I feel protective for the listeners that have the wound of too much. And I think that if you're neurodivergent, you have that wound of too much. And this has happened when you've been telling me about someone else who's bothering you. And I think I do that. And so I think that there are some of us that, like, I'm just feeling concerned that there are listeners that are going like, oh my gosh, I burden people and now I can't share, because I think that we have a really hard time differentiating how we are presenting and how we're showing up. And I know that there are people, and this is true for me, and I think I've shared that I've gone back into therapy. I have a therapist who's autistic, ADHD, PDA profile with RSD, and it's been so helpful. And when I really struggle concretely with this dizziness that I'm experiencing of, do I push myself? Am I coddling myself? And also this sense of validation of, am I just being dramatic? And what she said that I appreciated is like, we're the canaries in the coal mine. And people usually don't like the canaries. And I had a couple days where I really kind of let myself rest, and then I pushed myself and I overdid it, and really trying to figure that out. And that sort of relates to this. Do I share too much? Do I not share enough? Is it okay to talk about what's going on? And so I think if we can give very concrete examples of what it looks like when we're coming from a place of being in it. And I have to say that, you said that it is okay to have a pity party. I think that we need to own and acknowledge that things are hard. To pretend that they're not going on, I think, is a disservice. But like you said, do we unpack our bags and do we live in that place? But how can you and I make some very concrete examples for listeners? Because what I don't want any of the listeners to walk away with is like, see, I knew it. I am being too much and I can't share anything. That is not where we're coming from at all. And so I feel very protective.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Of course. I mean, it's an interaction, right? So part of what we're talking about is how do we know when we're talking with another person? And just to speak for a minute to the too muchness, that is directly related to the capacity of the other person, which has nothing to do with you.
I get that as an adult, but as a child, and I think many of us had parents or caregivers that did not have the capacity to deal with our curiosity and our questioning and our fascination with things and our need for connection and wanting to understand why and not understanding why the rules were the way they were and wanting things to be fair and just. And our parents don't have the capacity generally to go like, I don't have the bandwidth, you're okay, but this isn't a great time for me. But we get the stop asking questions, stop being you. And as kids, for survival, we have to believe that there's something wrong with us. And even as adults, I was just unpacking this yesterday about this wound that I have that came up 4 times this last week, twice with you, around feeling like I don't matter, the wound of I don't matter. And I've looked at my mother wound a lot. And so we started to look at this, and it's a father wound. And, I'm 60 years old, and my biological father was not involved in my life. The man who adopted me was around till I was 5 and then was in and out of my life sporadically because he was ambivalent about being a father, but never said that to me. And no therapist ever asked me about this father wound. And this is the wound that comes up a lot around, I don't matter, I'm not important, I'm not being seen. And it's like, yeah, because I was basically abandoned by 2 father figures. And how this ties back in is we have these wounds that show up in our adult relationships. And if we can have either hard, I can continue to have the heart of having attachment wounds come up with you and in other relationships. You and I do an amazing job of working through them. I don't think that that's very typical for most relationships, and it takes a lot of work. Or I can do the other heart of going back and looking at this historical wound of where it came from and hopefully do some healing so that it's not as strong. But I think that when we have these wounds, they don't heal fully. we do have this big sense of emptiness or loneliness or hurt, but we learn how to live with it. And I think there's a tremendous, terrible, awful, yucky disservice when we see things about learn these ways to get rid of anxiety, depression, heal your trauma. Yes, we can learn how to manage it. Yes, we can see what happens so that we don't get activated as easily. But I think that expectation that people give that you'll become an untraumatized person, an unwounded person, I think is so damaging. I think it's incredibly damaging.
Absolutely. I completely agree. It's funny. It is definitely intellectually satisfying to know where some of the wounds come from. And I have one in particular wound that gets me every time. And if I hadn't been told a childhood story about it, there would be no way that I would have remembered this. It was pre-verbal, pre-memory. When it comes up, I can tell because it lands in such a primitive place. But that is intellectually satisfying. And it's our intellect that's really overdeveloped, right? Just the way we live. But that's not where historically have found the healing comes from. I think the healing itself, which is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about healing. So whether the healing is the promise that you won't have XYZ anymore, or I think the healing comes from being willing to be in relationship with this aspect of being human, and specifically this aspect of your history. So being willing to be in relationship with it and having that relationship be rooted in kindness, right? In compassion for yourself first and primarily. Sometimes that compassion comes for the other players, but that's not what I focus on generally. That's not what's important, right? And I know that's another big whole section of like forgiveness and all that stuff, or trying to understand. Understanding can help you in context, but that's not like the healing part. The healing is the energy with which we hold it, which is kind of taking me back to where we started the conversation. It's like, what's the energy that's surrounding this? And if we're all doing the best we can. I am such an optimist in that regard, right? There's basic goodness and then there's ignorance. I mean, how many of us are walking around and we don't even know we have attachment wounds and they're running the show, right? That's what we do. We make the unconscious conscious in our healing work. That's what we're trying to do. And then can we make it conscious and can we hold it? I often say like it's inherent to being human, having trauma. Being birthed is traumatic. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like on the way out. On the way in, it was bumpy. The way out, I don't know. I mean, this is why people meditate, right? Preparation for a good death and everything in between. Being willing to be in it and then holding it. It's funny. It doesn't preclude moments of anger, confusion. I can get as like salty and snarky as the best of them, and letting that flow, right? It's when you get stuck in any of those one things. If I can get stuck in being conflict avoidant, which doesn't serve me, but nor would it serve me to be stuck on anger and a rageaholic, right? Like, we want to be very fluid and we want to have the whole range of experiences open to us. I don't know. Is that helpful at all?
It is helpful. Yes. And I want to go back because we talked about giving concrete examples about what does it look like when you're coming from that place of you're in it as opposed to naming what's going on. That I feel like we promised something and I want to deliver on that. Okay. Yeah, let's do it. So some concrete examples. Yeah. I think the other part of this is that say that I'm owning my stuff and I'm just telling you what's going on. I don't have an expectation of you to take it away. I'm just saying, I'm having dizziness. I'm struggling with blah, 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 blah. So I'm coming from a place where there's nothing, what I'm doing needs to be changed. Not that there's a right or wrong, but just for the sake of this conversation. But you feel like you need to change or fix what's going on with me. You may feel burdened when I'm not doing anything right. And you may feel like, ugh, how come? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that
Patricia's
up.
always talking about this stuff. And it's every time we get on the call and I say, how are you? She dumps all this stuff and it feels like too much and I feel burdened. And that burden is because you feel like you're supposed to be fixing it or doing something about it, or you have a hard time holding space for my difficult feelings, but I'm okay with them. I'm just relaying what's going on. So I think it's really important that we look at, you kind of started with this. Is this your capacity or is it how I'm communicating or is it a combination of the two?
Yep. It's funny. I had just last night, one of my children came up to my room. I'm on the 3rd floor, right? And so they come up into my room and they were feeling sad. And I did not have a lot of emotional capacity in that moment, which about a half an hour later, I was able to round back and just acknowledge, hey, I just want to acknowledge, like, you came up to me feeling sad and I did not have the emotional availability for you. I've taken a few breaths. I actually discharged some of the emotion where it needed to go instead of having it come out sideways at you. And now I'm feeling more grounded. Like I have the capacity now that I didn't have even half an hour ago. So even just that like awareness, right, of being able to, and hopefully let yourself off the hook for that, because we are limited as human beings. Like we have limits and sometimes they're a moving target and sometimes some of our limitations are a little less fluid, right? And then there was also a part of the interaction that my person that I wanted to, and both of my kids will do this to some extent sometimes, in that they want to draw me close and they will also push me away. So I also think that there's differing degrees of intimacy too. There have been moments where I thought I was getting on a FaceTime with you to have a normal conversation and like not even a breath in and I am just in tears and it shocked me. And you were like, whoa, and we're able to hold space for me. Right. So I guess what I'm trying to say and just add on to what you were saying, it's a dynamic thing. So keep yourself in context, right? And nothing that you're going to be experiencing with another person boils down to something that can be said completely about just you.
I still want to get concrete.
Okay.
So I'm wondering how we can do that. And because I don't experience a lot of this in my life, I feel really blessed that I don't really have a lot of this. It's hard for me to think of examples and how to explain it. So the best thing that I can do is to maybe ask, what is your intention when you share? And I think many of us have not felt heard, seen, validated. And I have this where I feel like if I get a diagnosis and I feel like, see, I'm not making it up. This is real. I get medication. I'm referred for some kind of therapy that it's real. So I think that many of us have experienced a lot of gaslighting and experiencing things. And if you're neurodivergent, your brain is wired differently. You notice things, you hear things, you see things. I mean, we kind of joke in my house. My kids were here and they kind of joke like, the subject is having moles that are cancerous removed. And if you're a cancer survivor and this is offensive, then please forgive me. But one of my sons jokes with my husband that, he's a 2-time cancer survivor. But the thing is, both of those times, I'm the one that noticed the mole and said, there's something wrong. You need to go to the dermatologist. And my husband and my 2 boys are all kind of like, it's nothing. We don't need to wash your hands. We can leave meat out on the counter. If you leave meat on the counter and you're okay with that, that's fine. Things that are very important to me. And I feel like I've been gaslit a lot in my own home because the 3 males are very much like, it doesn't matter. It's nothing. And, mom is the one that's hysterical. Mom is the one that's anxious. Mom is the one that worries about everything. And I've had to have talks with them about, you need to be more respectful in the language that you're using with me. Just because this is not important to you doesn't mean it's not real and doesn't mean that it's not important. And I suspect with one of my kids that what I say actually creates anxiety. And instead of saying, I feel really nervous when you bring these things up, that the reaction is that I get called anxious or I get labeled with things. But the reality is my husband's had cancer cut out of him twice because I noticed it and he didn't think it was anything and nobody else noticed. So how do we honor these things that go on that are real? And I think there is sometimes this drive that it's like, what I'm feeling is true. Can somebody else see it? And that need to be validated. And there's this, it's a very young part. And so if you have that and then you're wondering, am I complaining? I mean, I struggle with this. So is there any way that we can be a little bit more concrete about how somebody can check what their intentions are, how other people are responding? But again, it depends on what the capacity of the other person is.
Yeah. I mean, I think if by concrete, you mean,
what does it look like?
I think taking that breath, although sometimes I don't know, I guess it all depends, right? Because when did that happen? It feels like it was just a couple of days ago that I kind of burst into tears within seconds of getting on the.
Well, it happened this morning.
Did it happen
right before we recorded?
Morning? Yeah, it did too, didn't it? Jeez Louise.
Yeah.
I'm like, I am doing my work. So yeah, I guess I'm not sure. I think if you can acknowledge the other person and check in around consent.
Mm-hmm.
Is this okay? I know this is a lot. I actually did it at a little New Year's Eve gathering because I was starting to go off in a total nerd. And this poor guy, I was like, oh no, I'm being like that person at a party. I can stop now. And I was reading it wrong, or he was just being super nice. I was like, no, this is okay. He was asking me some questions about some clinical stuff and I had all pumped up about my special interest, right? So whether it's getting kind of swept away by a special interest and doing an info dump on someone, or whether it's getting swept up by an emotion that you're having or an experience you're having, I think if you are with another person, there's probably a way to do this even inside ourselves, just check in. I think it's probably the most concrete, easiest thing is, and you're really beautiful at doing this. I've really learned a lot from watching you do it. How is this for you to hear? Because you're acknowledging that there is, you may be broadcasting something, but then there's a receiver. And that receiver could be having lots of space for it, or the receiver could be like triggered or feel overwhelmed because they don't know how to be there for you. And so there's this obviously not expecting that the person's going to receive it exactly. I have someone in my life right now that is not really liking how I'm showing up, wants to give me a script of very specific things to say. And then I feel like I say them and then but it's not quite enough, or it wasn't said in quite the right way. And that sort of controlling stuff, I know I'm like that does not feel good to me. So then if I'm showing up in a way that's not good for you, please take good care of yourself. Tell me so, cut me off, go take care of yourself. But to try to continue to poke and prod me to show up a certain way is like, oof, I don't know. That seems at the moment to be a losing strategy now. Strategy sometimes doesn't work until it does work. So I'm not even prepared to say that it's never going to work, but it has not worked yet. I'll just put it that way. Right. So checking in with your person and honoring their autonomy, their limitations. And also that goes for you too, honoring your own autonomy, your own limitations. And there are moments where I'm just like, oof, I got to pull myself together. And I now have to go take care of my heart. If the person doesn't have the capacity, and that's okay. It doesn't mean the relationship's over. It doesn't mean, is that helpful? Am I concrete yet, Patricia?
You're getting there. Well, you and I have a very different way of expressing and communicating. And so my need for concreteness may need to come from me and not from you, just because we conceptualize things differently, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah. But what I like that you said is, what is the person who's sharing? What am I needing? Where am I at? And I'll be very transparent here that my wound of too much informs a lot of the ways that I communicate. It's a trauma response. It's healthy and it's adaptive, but it comes from a place of fear of overwhelming the other person. And I cried with my therapist yesterday because a couple of sessions that we've had, I feel like I've been very untethered and not contained. And my fear is, and we talked about this, is that when our session is over, that she's going to feel burdened and we'll have to do things to kind of release the burden of my feelings. That's from my wounding.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of how I communicate is informed from that place of being afraid that I'm going to be too much, you're not going to process it, and then you're not going to want to be around me. So I'm sharing this because for those of you that go like, Patricia, you're so amazing in your communication. Yes, I am. And that's informed by my trauma.
Yeah.
And so trauma is kind of a mixed bag. And if I didn't have this trauma, I may not be a communicator. I may not communicate the way that I do because I wouldn't be concerned about it. And it's interesting. I was listening to somebody close to me talk on the phone the other day, and the person said, "How are you?" to the other person. And the person shared the first couple of minutes about what was going on. And I talked to my therapist about this. I had this thing of like, you better ask about the other person. Like, you're taking up too much space. Like, this is how my trauma shows up in other relationships, worrying about like, you're not being reciprocal enough. You have to ask about the other person. So a lot of the ways that I ask for consent, while I think that they're adaptive and they're effective strategies for communication, are informed by my trauma. I don't want to take up too much space. And if I'm too self-absorbed, then you may not want to be around me anymore. And I think it's important that we talk about this. And I was just talking with someone recently who has a conflicted relationship, and my friend has pretty much left the relationship, and the other person kind of keeps reaching out. But my friend is left because of a lot of things that have happened in this relationship. And we talked about, you pretty much don't have the relationship. So do you want to have a hard conversation and practice? Because my friend does not like conflict. If it's uncomfortable, forget it. But there's a lot of history here. You know, are you willing to have a hard conversation? And you're pretty much out the door with the relationship or not. And so they communicated with, their friend and said, I think we need to have a hard conversation. And the friend said, can we not call it a hard conversation?
Aw.
That control thing got me a little spun up there.
Yeah.
And I think that it can be hard if you're someone that doesn't like conflict and just kind of wants to keep the peace. But then all these layers build up of all these things that don't work that we don't talk about. And the other person said, yeah, I feel the same way. We have some things we really need to talk about because nobody's been willing to talk about it.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds, I almost want to like, keep me posted that they make it. Like, did they, because it's funny. Like, I know in the person that was trying to like script everything I say, she was like, well, aren't I supposed to ask you for what I need? I'm like, absolutely. Yes. So I don't know.
Well, I think that it's hard too. And what I had said to this friend was, you may have this conversation, but I don't know that this person has the skills because this person does what your friend's person, what this person is doing to you, sets what they think are boundaries, but they're walls. They're walls about, you can't talk about this and you can't talk about this. And it feels very rigid and very controlling. And because my friend often doesn't know how to get clarification or to say that doesn't feel okay, these things build up. And it was really nice because this is someone I'm very close to. And they said, I tried to say like, we have a lot of intimacy in our relationship because we've had conflict and we've worked through it.
Yes.
How has that been? And I got some really nice feedback about how they feel safe with me talking through things because of the skills that I have where, I sometimes, I've told you, like, I'm afraid I'm hard to be friends with. I'm afraid I demand too much. And so this is all hard stuff. Just which hard do you want?
Well, it's funny. You're making me think like, I know that I was talking with you the other day about something really, really personal. And my projection was that this was going to be too much, that it was going to be a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And you were like, I don't have any kind of buzz. Like, I'm just here. So, I think it's important to test out the narratives that we have in our head about things too.
Yeah.
Hard is not a word I would use. It's intimacy, right? It's showing up. It's just making space for and staying curious with each other.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when we hold things too rigidly, where are the edges of that? Like everything in balance, right? If we're too rigid, then maybe we're not meeting life and the people in it enough on life's terms and enough on the, you know what I mean? And that's why I like the checking in and it being the fluid, and even day to day, it'll change. I mean, there are some times where we've got great capacity for each other, and then I don't know, have you and I ever had that moment where it's like, wait a minute, we both can't freak out at once? Or have
We
too
may
much
have it.
going
If
on.
it's happened, it didn't stick in my head, which means either it hasn't happened or it did, and we work through it so that there's nothing in my brain that goes like, ooh, this was a dangerous thing that I need to remember.
Yeah. I mean, I know you and I, even on the podcast here, have been talking a long time about conflict as an invitation to increase intimacy, right? Because we socially construct each other in our heads. And instead of interacting with the you that I have in my head all the time and then getting mad when actual you shows up differently than the one that's in my head, it's a chance to be like, whoa, okay, so what drilling down in that kindness and curiosity about what the conflict's about. And usually it's not, we keep finding over and over, and I know this is true for me too, it's not necessarily about what it's about, that it's an old wound and an old belief or an old story, right? Yeah. Back to, I mean, if you want concrete tools, nonviolent communication is a great one.
Yeah. My brain is just kind of has nothing to say in the moment. I do want to respond to something that you said, that, you had this information to share that you haven't shared with me in the time that we've known each other, which is either going on 5 or 6 years. We really need to figure that out.
It just makes me giggle. We can't figure it out.
And you shared this information that was very intense and like a burden to you. And I had no reaction. And we talked about this a little bit because I often wonder, is this my autism? Like, should I be having a bigger reaction? And am I just kind of like, okay, that was information? Because a lot of what I process feels like data. I'm like, oh, that was just some data. And I did not have a reaction. So part of the conversation was like, am I underreacting? And really, even to this day, I'm like, it was just data. And I think because it was such a burden to you, that you were unburdening, but had that feeling. And I've had this too when, I mean, this is a totally different example, but I'm wanting something and I just can't do it. Like wrapping Christmas presents feels like too much, or I'm wanting food from a restaurant, but the thought of getting in my car and going feels like too much. And I don't want to ask anybody, because if it feels overwhelming to me, I assume that it's overwhelming for someone else. And my mom and husband wrap some of my Christmas presents. Steve will hop in the car and go anywhere. We're like, I'll just go without. And so, often what feels hard for us is not for somebody else.
And I mean, I think the word we have for that is projection, right? We're projecting something that's our truth on and assuming that it's the truth for someone else.
Yeah.
It's making me think about some of my trauma work and doing EMDR or brain spotting, or, where when something is unprocessed trauma is very different day to day, very different in our nervous systems from processed trauma, right? And so that it's data, because when we look at trauma, we look at like, where's the hot spot? Where's the swell of emotion that comes up as information, right? That's data too. It's a different kind of data, right? And then pausing, honoring, just holding that with compassion, not being scared of it, right? Being able to feel the full range of human emotions fully. And there's nothing complicated to do here except feel it to the degree that you can, hopefully. Sometimes, being with a therapist, a coach, someone, this can be helpful to not be scared of it, right? Just to be able to process it, honor it, feel it. We feel things on different levels, right? There's like the feeling of just the physical sensations in your body. And you can feel when something's hot, right? Or you can feel it in right? And then level 2 is kind of the meaning we make out of that, and the judgments or beliefs or the story that we kind of tell around it. I think sometimes when I'm working with someone, we'll go up to like a level 3 of some concrete decisions have to be made about something that's associated or that's triggering all of this, and then the more processing we do, a lot of times, you see this very clearly in EMDR, the data's there, and you've taken the wisdom out of the wound, and you've metabolized or drained, or whatever metaphor we want to use for processing and you can tell, because then it can be, oh yeah, that happened. And it can be data without all of the, right? And it's the
Right.
willingness, again, I'm just going to keep coming back to this phrase, the willingness to be in relationship with whatever aspect of your life or being human or your experience or history or whatever aspect of a dynamic that you happen to be having. And it usually shows up, like it'll pop up in other places, right? 'Cause, like whatever that is, it's willing to be in relationship, being willing to honor, experience. That can be exhausting. So it's healthy to get help with that. And then, it does transform. It doesn't go away. Something else might trigger it, but the willingness to be, there you are. That's why parts work is so beautiful, right? Because we kind of go back to when it happened, imagine ourselves at that time, the limitations we had at that time to make sense of our world. What belief did we encode about that? And that part of you, right? That part of me will get re-triggered by different situations. But I know her, like and you belong to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm here to take care of you, right? I'm here to chaperone my parts. So I think it is a journey that the degree to which we're able to do that and then bring that to other people. That's the difference of speaking from a part or for a part.
Well, and here's what I'm wondering, and then we kind of need to wrap up because of time. I'm wondering if it's that place of unprocessed trauma and coming from the part. So for me, and we've talked about this on the podcast. I've done this with you before. I'm not real proud about it. But when I'm in that place, it's like, I don't feel good and I want you to magically take it away. I want you to intuit what I need. I want you to intuit what to say. It's a really young part. And I feel angry and frustrated when it doesn't happen because part of that wound and that need is not having to articulate what it is. And I'm wondering if that is this whole episode. I've been like, we need to get concrete about what this is. And I'm wondering if that is one of the primary ways to identify that that's what's going on. And I think what helps me, I still fall into that place, but I do this thing always with my hands out, my palms up of, one hand is, this is the pain, the trauma, that whatever it is that's going on, and honoring that. And then kind of the balance of what is that. So like for the dizziness, it's like acknowledging that it's not as bad as it was. And I'm just kind of learning how to lean into it. And I'm getting curious instead of being distressed, because I think there's a part of me that feels afraid that I'm going to get consumed and overwhelmed and in a hopeless place. I think if I'm going to get really honest, and I think the way that I manage that is by acknowledging what's not feeling okay, but countering it by something that feels like it's true and angers me. And yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's a nuisance. Yes, I had to hold on to that counter when I was blow drying my hair this morning because I was able to turn upside down, but I had to have my hand on the counter because I thought I might fall over if I didn't. And I got to style my hair in a way that makes me feel good because I haven't been able to because I've had to keep my head really still. So I think that may be one way to differentiate of, are you acting from that part or are you speaking for that part that's struggling?
Yeah. Yes.
Anything else before we wrap up?
I think that there's something about chaperoning that part that will bring in those other perspectives, right? So the perspective of the part that needs to be honored. And even those spaces where you may be very fearful, that it's when we're coming from a single part, it's like all the other parts go to sleep. So we only have the perspective of that one part, right? And even if just to breathe and to be able to wait, woof, I'm really in it, is great, because then there's some awareness, right? And sometimes we can't even do that. Sometimes we're just in it.
Yeah.
But then to be able to look around and see other perspectives. I mean, I'm kind of getting this picture in my head of there's you, there's big you, right? And with your arm around little you, who's fully validating what little you is feeling and pointing at different vistas as well in time, because we don't want to do that before we've really validated and heard our pain, because that's part of what unprocessed trauma is that it's not fully witnessed.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah. Beautiful. Glad you're feeling better.
Yeah, thanks. Me too. And you thought we'd have to throw out this episode because we didn't know what we were going to talk about today.
I'm always wrong. I'm so happy to always be wrong about this. I know I start every episode. I'm like, this is going to be the one. This is going to be the one we're going to throw out. just takes all the pressure off for me.
If this is offensive to anybody, I'm sorry. I just find it humorous. And I say, I rebuke you.
That's our little ritual. That's how we bless the podcast.
It is. Well, I think that's allowing it to be okay that it doesn't work, but I just don't accept that. So, yeah. All right. Anything else?
No, that's all I got, my friend.
Okay. All right. I'll talk to you later, friend.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Hey again. So what in that resonated for you, and how is it for you having hard conversations? And do you like calling them hard conversations, or is conflict really uncomfortable for you? Do you have intimacy in your life? Do you have closeness? Do you want closeness? Is it even worth it? I think that when we've had a lot of trauma, it's not even worth it. It just feels like it takes too much work. So if anything in this resonated for you and you're wanting help, you're wanting support, and you want to work with Jen, you can reach out to Jen at heartfulnessconsulting.com. If you're interested in working with me, I think I have a little bit of space open right now. You can reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive.com. I've got a form on my website that you can fill out. We can do a free 20-minute consult. I want you to get the support you need. I want you to thrive. I want you to know that there's a place where you can feel seen and heard, and whatever's going on, Jen and I have the ability and capacity to hold space for you so that you can work through some of these traumas. I think if you're neurodivergent, you've had trauma. That's just how it is. We're wired differently. People don't understand us. And even if we grow up in households with other people that are neurodivergent, there's still trauma because there's generational trauma that gets handed down. So I'd just love to see you thrive. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's how your brain is wired. You have a right to be uncomfortable. You have a right to have hard discussions. You have a right to not have them if that feels dysregulating. It's okay to want to work things through. It's okay to not want to deal with conflict. It's okay to have joy. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel like you're too much. It's okay to want people to intuitively know what you need and how to fix and make you feel better. The chances of that happening are pretty small. So if your expectation is that that's what you want and people should be doing that, how's that working for you? I don't think that is a great formula for long relationships that work. And we find people in our lives that we can work our stuff through. I think that we really have this. It's called the compulsion to repeat. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but when we have things that are unresolved, we have this need to keep trying to work it through until we figure out what it is. And so if you're seeing patterns in your relationships that are not working, you're probably trying to work something through, but there's a piece that's missing, and having somebody work with you may be helpful. But you have a right to all of your feelings, all of your thoughts, the joys, the sadness. I'm curious to know how it landed with you about our belief that your wounding stays with you, that emptiness stays with you, the loneliness stays with you, but you find ways to manage it, but it's still kind of there with you. It just doesn't have to run the show. I think that's all I have. Have a blessed day.